Welcome to the 2014 EWTN Family Celebration, The Joy of the Gospel from Birmingham, Alabama. And now the address by Feast and Seasons host Joanna Bogle, which was presented at the 2014 EWTN Family Celebration. Did you know that Joanna was from England? Let me see, where are the other jokes I had here that aren't working? Anyway, she's the one and only Auntie Joanna, along with Jamie Bogle, her husband. They've done a couple of series for us. She's a popular host, British author, journalist, broadcaster living in London. She's had several books, and I've had the great pleasure of having her on my little program, Bookmark, including a book of seasons and celebrations, and now she's got that in her 5th edition. And that's really where we came up with the idea of the Feasts and Seasons program, traditional feasts and seasons of the year, and which gave rise to our multi-year series, and still popular. Her latest EWTN project, the one I was alluding to, something you can look forward to again, is a program on St. John Paul II with her fellow British writer, Claire Anderson. They shot it on location, produced on location in Poland. It's a wonderful program in the footsteps of the Pope. And there's a follow-up one on his legacy that's also in the planning works right now. And Joanna keeps busy. She likes to walk, gets that walking shoes on, gets her bumper chute out and walks around London, whether it's raining or not. And we decided to turn that into a program as well. We don't waste any time here at EWTN. So Joanna has a nice program called Walking Through Time. There are basically history walks of Catholicism around London. She also regularly lectures to Catholic and other groups and any other person who listen about the truth of the Catholic faith, and certainly from a pro-life perspective. She's been a great advocate for that cause on the BBC and other places when they needed someone to stand up for the truth. She's active with the Association of Catholic Women and for several years chairman of the British section of the international charity Aid to the Church in Need, good friends of ours, and we carry their programming. And Pope Benedict XVI invested Joanna as a Dame of St. Gregory. Now the one and only, we know her as Auntie Joanna.
Well, it's an enormous honor to be here in Birmingham at the EWTN Family Festival. And hasn't it been absolutely super so far? I mean, it is tremendously exciting to be here, really. And it means I can answer all the questions people will have when I get back home. Like, is that a real cowboy hat that Father Mitch wears? And how does Father Robert Barron know all that wonderful stuff? And from my husband, when you're finished doing all that cookery stuff, is there any chance of a cup of tea for the old man? One of the things that EWTN is doing extremely well, and one of the reasons why it's enormous fun to work for the program, for the whole network, is that it fosters the idea of Catholic culture. George Weigel notes in his magnificent biography of Pope Saint John Paul that his big discovery from the great Pope is that it is culture that drives history over the long haul. Growing up in Britain in the last decades, as with people growing up in America, I was very much aware of living in a democracy. And so when one thought about campaigning on an issue about bringing the Christian faith into the public sphere, it was very normal to think in terms of lobbying Parliament, changing our government, especially when they come up with something exceptionally stupid, like the idea that two chaps of the same sex can marry. Sorry, is one allowed to say that? Well, anyway, I'm stupid. Yeah. And one of the lessons we have learned from the Polish Pope, who carried out his magnificent ministry as priest and archbishop in circumstances where they were not free to change their government and could not vote properly and were not able to speak freely about things, one of the lessons we learned is about culture. The church is the mother of culture, and it is culture that drives history over the long haul. If I can give a trivial example from my own country, I think, although I'm not absolutely certain about this, But I think it's true that there is still, on the statute book in English common law, a law that says that it's illegal to eat mince pies at Christmas, introduced by the Protector Cromwell. Well, as you may have noticed in Britain, if you've ever been there in the month of December, we eat a lot of mince pies at Christmas. It is culture that drives history. It's what people are and what they do that matters, and not merely the government. And this is something very important for all of us who are involved, as we all are, in the Ministry of Catholic Television. It's a sign of enormous hope. So here we are, gathered together in Birmingham to look at issues connected with our Catholic faith and how we can bring it joyfully alive in the 21st century. The way that you pronounce the name of this city helps me with the next point I'm going to make, because you describe it as Birmingham. And in Britain, where we had a city of that name before you did, it's not actually a particularly old city, Birmingham, in England. It's in the middle. You know, England's long, L-shaped, with Scotland at the top and all that, and Wales on the side, an island over there, near a U, sort of thing. Right, well, Birmingham's in the middle, sort of about halfway up. The name Ham, as in Birmingham, Westerham, Caterham, Nottingham, the name Ham, as I'm sure you know, means a town or a village. And it's an indication that it's a real place, as opposed to, say, somewhere that's a port, which begins as a place where ships go in, and so on. So Birmingham in England, Birmingham in America, I'm so impressed, by the way, even your children can do American accents. It's just terrific. I'm really impressed with that. There was a little girl, presumably like me, got lost going around this enormous Soviet modern building. And isn't it funny? I got lost terribly at one point, and I thought, but they send people to get you, don't they, after a week or two? Anyway, one little girl was saying to her companion, "I'm going to go down the elevator by myself." And I thought, well, I hope so, dear, that you just don't get lost down there. But I thought, very commendable American spirit of independence and so on. Birmingham is a ham. And I'm going to talk about two hams in England, one with some rather bad news and one with some good, and both very much related to this understanding of culture driving history. In the City of London, one of the most important landmarks is the Tower of London, with its grisly reputation as a place of imprisonment and torture for some of our great English martyrs. And the area beyond the Tower, going a little further down the river and all around the Tower, is known as Tower Hamlets, because these were the small hamlets, small villages that surrounded the Tower. The Borough Council of the London Borough of Tower Hamlets is currently 100% Islamic. The mayor of Tower Hamlets is Islamic, and the black flag of militant Islam has been flying from public buildings. Now, this is partly because there was a lot of skullduggery in the elections, which is currently being explored through the legal process in Great Britain, and there is some evidence of coercion, bribery, and very great corruption in the London Borough of Tower Hamlets electoral processes in the recent London Borough elections. But even when that has been discovered, and perhaps some action has been taken, it remains true that a large number of Islamic people in the borough of Tower Hamlets took their convictions seriously enough to take them to the ballot box. As a matter of fact, the entire population of Tower Hamlets is by no means Islamic. It is a very mixed area, or as the trendy expression has it, it's very diverse. In fact, the reason that the skullduggery and corruption were possible, among other reasons, is that there is the possibility to say to Islamic people that they should take things seriously and turn up to vote. And it's an important lesson for the rest of us. Do we turn up? There's a famous saying that 90% of getting things done is simply turning up. And a friend told me the other day that his father, a rather distinguished man, had become a Roman Catholic simply because he noticed that week after week, year after year, that priest at the Catholic Church turns up day after day. He thought that was pretty impressive. It sounds silly, but history is written by the people who turn up. On my way here, I came via Heathrow Airport. And at one point, they take hours and hours to search you, because obviously I look like a terrorist and so on. And so when they'd finished doing all that, I had quite a lot of time to spare once I'd got through to the other side. And there was a sign to a smallish room, which 7 or 8 years ago, I remember, would have been marked by a cross, and today is labeled the interdenominational prayer area. So I went there, and it's divided into 3. As you go in, there's an arrow marking the direction of Mecca. And then you come to the 2 areas, one for men and one for women, marked for Islamic worship. And then at the end, there is a room for Christian worship. There is no cross, but there is a table on which 2 Bibles are placed very reverently and some quite attractive evangelical tracts suggesting how you could make use of the Bible. And there was no one there. And it very much had the feeling that nobody had been in that room for a great while. So I sat down, opened the Bible where the ribbon marker was, thinking that perhaps the Lord had chosen the best place, and it was Paul writing to the Corinthians, made the sign of the cross in a loud voice, and read aloud from the scriptures. As I did so, I was aware that the murmur of voices in the ladies' bit of the Islamic section, which was next to me, had ceased. And when I announced, "Our Father, who art in heaven," you could have heard a pin drop. When I left to catch my plane, the thought occurred to me, what a difference it would make if every Catholic who went through Heathrow simply went there to pray. They'd have to make it a bit bigger then, wouldn't they? Suppose it got to the point where it was so normal to have substantial numbers of people turning up that it was worth making a good-sized chapel. Suppose every time you or I went through an airport, we always went to the Christian place to pray. Every time. If we just turned up, it would make a difference, wouldn't it? History is written by the people who turn up. Culture is shaped by the people who turn up. A chapel at an airport might be necessary and useful if enough people turned up to pray there. Spread the word. Spread it among your Catholic friends and among your good evangelical friends. Have you had the experience, because I have, when you're reading Magnificat, or perhaps saying your rosary on a bus or a train, and you see somebody opposite or a little way away quietly reading a Bible? It's an evangelical reading their daily Bible prayer. And you make that very attractive eye contact, sort of like the early Christians drawing a fish in the sand. And there's a real momentary communion of minds and hearts. You might nod and smile, or thumb up, or thank you. Perhaps like me, you've had the experience of seeing somebody quietly reading a Bible on a bus and thinking, didn't actually get around to saying my prayers this morning. And quietly doing so. And you're able to say, thanks for the reminder, as you pass. If enough people read the Bible on the bus, or got out their copy of Magnificat, or said the rosary on the bus, culture would change. History is written by the people who turn up, and culture is shaped by the people who turn up, the people who do things. Walsingham is a very different place from Tower Hamlets. It's on the eastern part of Britain, East Anglia. That's the bit where the Angles invaded from the east, pushing the ancient I suppose you know your history. You know Roman Empire? Yeah. I know it sounds awful, but when you're talking to people, not you, of course, but when you're talking to people in Britain, none of them have been taught history for the last 2 or 3 decades, and so you have to sort of explain. Right, Roman Empire, collapse of Roman Empire, invasion of the Angles and Saxons, yes, right? Well, they came, of course, from Wales Saxony to the east of Britain, and so they came across what is East Anglia. And Walsingham is about 6 miles from the coast, about 6 miles from Wells next to the sea, and you will probably know that it is the place where the lady of the manor, who was connected to our Saxon royal family by marriage, and is known as Richeldis de Faverges. That's possibly a sort of name that means a rich and favored lady, but at any rate, it was her name. It's the name that history has given her. In the 11th century, had a vision of Mary. There's a huge significance in Walsingham. It is our national shrine to Our Lady. Oh, I know you haven't heard of it. Due to historical circumstances in 1535, we don't have a great shrine that is Catholic in the way that Lourdes or Fatima is. But Walsingham is our national shrine. Think about it. A time of great uncertainty, a rise of militant Islam, a certain worry about the leadership, rather weak and divided, of the government of the country. You think I'm talking about now? I'm talking about 1061, when militant Islam had taken over much of the Holy Land, and it was impossible for Christians to go there on pilgrimage. And there was a great deal of uncertainty about the future of the government of England, an uncertainty that would be resolved in 1066, when William of Normandy landed on our southern coast, with consequences of which you will be aware. Why did heaven favor Richeldis with a vision of Mary just at that time? Well, the reason is that it was much more important than just a message of hope. Mary made a specific request that Richeldis would build an exact replica of the holy house at Nazareth, where the incarnation took place, where the Word was made flesh and dwelt amongst us, and gave the exact specifications. And the holy house at Nazareth, of Nazareth, became important. Walsingham is England's Nazareth. There are all sorts of rather mysterious and fascinating things about Walsingham, much of which I learned from a lady who was responsible for researching the history because of the Church of Our Lady of Walsingham in Texas, and who is a considerable expert on the subject. Walsingham is exactly the same distance from the sea as Nazareth is from the Sea of Galilee. And even the layout, the original layout of the streets of what is now the tiny village of Walsingham, is the same as that of Nazareth, and there are many other parallels. Just to confuse you, and because England is like that, the main village is known as Little Walsingham, and there's a bit outside known as Great Walsingham. But we do that sort of thing to confuse, you know, visiting Americans and so on. And Little Walsingham has drawn pilgrims for centuries. The constellation of stars in the sky that we call the Milky Way is known in Old English tradition as the Walsingham Way, because the hundreds and thousands of people who crowded down the lanes of Norfolk and Suffolk to reach Walsingham on pilgrimage looked like the millions of stars on the Milky Way. Throughout England's great Catholic centuries, all sorts of people went on pilgrimage to Walsingham, including, and this is partly because of the royal connections, including many of our monarchs. And you will know about the last monarch to have done so, Henry VIII of the Tudor dynasty. Henry, who was a very pompous Catholic, who liked all the very traditional Catholic things. Don't get the idea this man was a Protestant at all. This was no Bible-praying Christian at all. This was a very fierce defender of the most rigid of Catholic doctrines. This was somebody who could never have imagined allowing his subjects to hear Mass in English. This was somebody who had very definite Catholic ideas on his own terms and not those of the successor of St. Peter, appointed precisely by God for the task of shepherding the church. Henry went with his wife Catherine on pilgrimage to Walsingham, praying for a son. And you will know that they did have many children, including sons, but they did not survive. One lived for only a month. And Henry decided, first, that this was all Catherine's fault. Second, that it was God's fault. And third, that the best possible policy was to ditch his wife and marry his mistress. An approach which has been followed by many a slob in the years that have followed, and which has done our poor country no good at all. And you will know that he took out his anger on, among many other places, Walsingham, and that the image of Our Lady of Walsingham was destroyed and burned. The religious houses, there were two, including a Franciscan friary, were wrecked. Their ruins stand to this day. And the shrine was desecrated. Interestingly, the great founder of the Methodist sect, John Wesley, a good and holy man, was one who wrote most movingly about the wreckage of Walsingham, saying that if Henry VIII had had an ounce of goodness in him, he would not have allowed so fine religious places to have been destroyed. John Wesley helped to revive Christianity in Walsingham, and the little Methodist chapel there, now a listed building, was visited by him shortly after it was built in the first fervor of Methodist enthusiasm. And you will probably know that the shrine of Walsingham was revived in the 20th century by Anglicans under the Reverend Hope Patton in the fervor of high Anglican enthusiasm following the tragedies of the Great War when England lost so many young men, and by Catholics beginning before that in the 1890s, acquiring the Chapel of Ease at Houghton St. Giles, which is known as the Slipper Chapel because it's along a slip or lane, and is traditionally the place where you remove your shoes to walk in penitential pilgrimage down to the village of Little Walsingham, which is what I did this past summer, as I have for several summers past, with people from the John Paul II walking pilgrimage for the new evangelization. You see, if there's a ham or hamlets in London that are losing the faith, Walsingham is doing its best to win our country back for Christ and Our Lady. If you have never walked barefoot down an English lane on a summer morning in high summer with a torrential rain pouring down and the most heavenly scent of England in the rain and the silence and the birdsong and the thick blackberries on the hedgerows, if you've never done that and splashed through the puddles, if you've never arrived soaking wet with lots of other pilgrims turning out of cars and coaches, if you've never seen young people with water streaming off them, talking and laughing and singing as they come down the lane, if you've never seen a drenched young Dominican with a habit soaked to him, or a laughing Dominican sister cheering everybody on, if you've never done that, you haven't lived, and you don't know what fun it is to be a Catholic. One of the things that is important about Walsingham is that it's an understanding of the role that culture and traditions and history have in our Catholic life. The shrine is not as big as it ought to be. The Catholic shrine attracts reasonable numbers, and on any given Sunday, especially in the summer, the big modern barn church is usually full, and there are people milling about. And throughout the summer months, various groups, Youth 2000, the New Dawn Charismatic Conference, and so on, hire the local fields from farmers, pitch tents, and have a week of celebration and teaching and confession and adoration of the Blessed Sacrament. And I was actually there earlier in the year, yes, it was raining again, with the National Association of Catholic Families, one of the wettest barbecues we've ever had, and we've been a number of experiences of wet barbecues. But there is a vibrancy about Walsingham, but it's not as big as it should be, and it's not as famous as it should be. It's the still, small voice rather than the storm. But it's an understanding of the ancient faith of our country and how it is to be revived. Not by government diktat, not by any quick fix, but by walking barefoot down the lane and by praying together and by understanding that evangelization has to start small and build up. Now, the church is the mother of culture, and this is something that we need to remember. Catholic schools in Britain are very popular. Parents do a great deal to try to get their children into schools, and most parish priests know what it is to be visited by enthusiastic parents with a 4-year-old. Well, we want her to be baptized, Father. Got nothing to do with getting her to the popular local Catholic school, of course. No, it's just we got a bit busy, Father, for the last, 4 years. Haven't got round to it. So the understanding that Catholic schools have got something to offer is very much there in Britain. Not all our Catholic schools are brilliant, but it is true that they have an edge on other schools. There is an understanding in our often pagan and vulgar culture that there is something special, something different about a Catholic school. There is an understanding that the Church knows something about history. There's an expectation that Catholics know it too. And one of the things that we as Catholics, all of us in every country, have to do is respond to that understanding. Ronald Knox, the famous Catholic writer and apologist, was for a while chaplain at Oxford University. The chaplaincy, then as now, was based in a fine old building dating back to medieval times that is called the Old Palace. And he once preached a very interesting sermon on the theme of a misprint. A lot of people wrote to him at the old place, missing out that A. And he preached on the theme that, yes, as a Catholic priest, I'm coming from the old place, where it all began, the original form of Christianity. People expect Catholics, they expect you and me, to know about the old place. They expect us to know our history. They expect us to have understanding of what Gothic architecture is for, not difficult, all pointing up to God. They expect us to know about saints and heroes. They expect us to have some understanding of the shape and the meaning of history. This is something that John Paul brought out so well. John Paul, and the same is very true of Benedict XVI, both men of place. Do you remember when Pope Benedict was asked about what nationality he was? And he said, "As a priest, I belong to everyone, everywhere, but my heart beats Bavarian." Isn't that wonderful? And do you remember Pope John Paul on that first unforgettable, history-changing visit to his beloved Krakow and Poland in 1979, described accurately as the 9 days that changed the world? Taking his leave, he said, "I must leave my beloved Krakow, where every brick and stone is dear to me." A Catholic is usually a person of place, even, perhaps especially, if they are exiled. Catholics have an understanding of loving their homeland, loving their hometown, loving the places that are dear to them. And I'm smiling because the next line is, even if it's not especially beautiful. There's no reason why you should know it, but I grew up in a place called Wallington in Surrey. That place name comes from the fact that long ago, I mean really long ago, at the time of the Anglo and Saxon invasions, it would have been a place of the Welsh, or strangers, hence Wales, where the original ancient Britons were pushed. Wallington, Wallingford, are the places where there were ancient British settlements. Well, there's a lot more folks living there now. I mean, it's been 1,500 years or so, it's not just Welsh now. On the contrary, very ordinary. It's just outside Croydon, if you know it. And if you want to look for somewhere really, really ugly, I'd go for Croydon, with the possible exception of our city of Birmingham, which is pretty ugly too. Everyone blames the Luftwaffe, but it was in the 60s and 70s. I was there. I remember the rebuilding. But I love Wallington because it's the place where I grew up. It's the place that's always home. And in the, frankly, ugly Catholic Church, that's where there's a record of my baptism. That's where I first made my confession. That's where I received our Lord in Holy Communion and where I was confirmed. That's where I made one of the best decisions of my life and pledged myself in holy matrimony to Joanna Bogle. A Catholic is a person of place. And even if that place means leaving it, exile, sorrow, or adopting another place, Catholics belong to places. We love them. We're interested in their history. We're interested in their culture. We are not Gnostics, as Father Barron reminded us. Places, things, stuff is good because God made them. And so Catholics must be unashamed at promoting real knowledge. The Church is the mother of culture. From the time that our mothers put our first pathetic bits of drawings up on the wall, or these days clip them with one of those trendy magnets to the fridge door, The church honors culture as a mother does. It's not fridge door magnets putting up children's pictures, but glorious stained art and statues and paintings, the most fabulous art that man has ever created, the most glorious soaring architecture, beauty, culture, and history. History is very badly taught in our schools in Britain. One of the things that I'm sometimes invited to do, nothing to do with my Catholic life really, but I'm sometimes invited to give talks on journalism. Well, I've stopped doing that now because there's absolutely nothing I can tell the internet generation, because I go back to the days when, it was hot metal and ink and paper. I belong to the days of public libraries, post offices, and those nice red places, telephone kiosks. So newspapers are probably going to go the way of all of those. So I don't. Instead, we talk about general knowledge. And I explain that if we want to be in the field of communication, we should have a reasonable working knowledge of the events of at least the last couple of 100 years. When was the Battle of Waterloo? And they mostly can't tell me. So I said, well, to within 40 years either way. That doesn't really help much. So I said, well, look, are we talking chain mail and longbows, or are we talking tanks and guns? I mean, are we talking Churchillian rhetoric, 1940s? Or are we back with, here's the hint, Wellington boots, Duke of, and they finally get to 1815, but slowly, slowly. And they don't understand that events have consequences. Why do they speak English in Australia? Well, because there were battles, and one country won. I'm not saying it's good or bad that a particular country wins, but events have consequences. If you win a major sea battle just off the coast of Trafalgar in 1805, you get command of the sea. That's why people speak English in Australia. See what I mean? No, they don't see what I mean, so you have to explain. And they don't understand the sweep of history. Well, what's all that got to do with the Catholic faith? Everything. Catholics understand, as Pope John Paul put it so well, that God accompanies man in his journey through history. God accompanies man in his journey through history. Pope John Paul taught us, and he did have to teach us, the importance of crossing the threshold of a millennium. Dates and anniversaries are important to Christians. The annual cycle of feasts and seasons, and the recording of jubilees, anniversaries, an anniversary of religious life, the silver, golden, and diamond weddings of our parents and our in-laws, birthdays, feast days, every day preciously recorded, every year part of the Anno Domini, the years of the Lord. Time is one of God's gifts to us. One day we will live in eternity, beyond time. Now we live in time. History is our department, and we must teach history. I'm going to finish by just explaining how joyful it can all be. In case you think that sounds rather dull, and that walking around London with one of Auntie Joanna's history walks is boring, I promise it isn't. It's wet, it's often raining, it's just the Lord, I think, having a joke, really. But we put on our brochures, come well prepared, we'll be walking whatever the weather. And it's hardly ever warm and sunny, it's often pouring with rain. But it's a myth about the London fogs. They were not natural, they were a product of 19th century industry, and they've gone. But when we learn about London's history, and European history, and American history, we're understanding the Catholic importance, the importance that Catholics attach to time. And history isn't boring, it's important and precious. I don't know how you teach it here in America, but one way we used to teach history in England was by easy things to remember that trip into the mind. So the kings and queens after the conquest would go, William, William, Harry, Stee, Harry, Dick, Jack, Harry, three. I don't know if you know that one. And it's quite easy to do poor old Henry VIII's wives, but presumably you know this one? Divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. This comes in handy for things like, well, we had street parties for Her Majesty's Jubilee, And I always do the Jubilee street party stuff for our road. So I did it for the Diamond and for the Golden Jubilee. And one of the standard questions for things like that, a street party, and you draw it into groups and do history and have tea in the middle of the road and everything. And so I always ask Henry VIII's wives. Nobody ever remembers them. They always get, could it be Lady Jane Grey? No, but you're in the right sort of territory. And nobody actually says, Marilyn Monroe, but we get the occasional Mrs. Simpson. No, but we're in sort of the right territory. Oh, and another one, incidentally, on more modern history. My mother remembers in the 1936, 37, children in London streets singing that autumn, "Hark there, old angels sing, Mrs. Simpson's pinched our king," which you got to admit. History matters. Culture matters. John Paul taught us that God accompanies man in his journey through history. And he taught us that culture can change things. Because the people of Poland held on to their faith, because they walked in processions, because they turned up for Mass, communism eventually had to crumble. If we are open about our Catholic faith, if we fill up our churches and our public spaces, if we have public Corpus Christi processions with little girls strewing flowers, they love doing it. I know they sometimes stuff them down the back of the neck of the kid in front and all that as well. At least they do in London. But they love it. If we do these things, we are evangelizing and we are changing our society. Memo to our bishops. I hope I don't get into trouble for this. Memo to our bishops. It would be easier to proclaim our Catholic faith publicly and to have displays and processions if you would please give us back our holy days on their proper days. It's so exciting to teach children about time and dates and anniversaries, and then explain to them that the Feast of the Ascension is exactly 40 days after Easter, and you can count it up. It's exciting when you can count up Lent, which is also 40 days, missing out the Sundays, of course, because each Sunday is a little Easter. Opinion divides on whether or not you eat chocolate, but that's up to you. You're probably more pious than I. It's so joyful to be able to say, today is Corpus Christi. See you at Mass at Westminster Cathedral. Let's go for a drink. It's so marvelous to be able to celebrate the feasts on the right days. And this is a heart-aching comment that I had from one teenager at a confirmation group, you can then answer questions like the one she put to me. You see, they have Ramadan. What do we have? What do we have? We South Londoners. But Catholics were honoring Lent with fasting and abstinence long before Islam was on the scene. And this is a joyful way to evangelize. This is evangelization with friendship, with hospitality, with goodwill, with a neighborly affection. This is evangelizing in a pleasing, welcoming way. This is inclusive. This isn't finger-wagging. This isn't making people feel uncomfortable. And people of other faiths like to understand that we have something. One reason why our young men in Britain, the newspapers say some 500 of them, have joined the militant jihadists, is because although they've grown up in modern Britain, and we have photographs of them in our newspapers with a ring round them pointing them out, in a school cricket team, they've had modern Britain with all its many, many advantages, but they feel there's nothing there spiritually. There's nothing to believe in. There's nothing to call the noble young hearts towards. Isn't that a tragedy with the centuries of Christian history? And so the call of militant Islam speaks to boyish hearts with a longing to do the heroic, the large, the noble. Isn't it a tragedy that it's been perverted into something like that? Islamic families can honor the Catholic family next door, who feast and fast, who raise their children to pray together every night, who know what it is to have a dignified, noisy, cheerful family meal where we thank God for the food beforehand, whose young people may go on pilgrimage to Walsingham or elsewhere. Well, here we can have some common bond of faith and joy and neighborliness and affection, yes. Sometimes we all think somebody else is doing it, and we should simply do the work. A little while back, I was invited to give a talk to a group of Jewish ladies. Well, in fact, strictly speaking, I wasn't invited. A chum was invited, Mary Kenny, the excellent Irish journalist, but Mary's husband was ill. And Mary phoned me up in this very sort of a very attractive, winning Irish way. Joanna, you wouldn't go and talk to these lovely Jewish ladies. I have to stay home with Richard. He's not well, you see. And she said, you'll get a lovely lunch, which I did. I had a lovely lunch. And when I began talking to these extremely nice Jewish ladies, they were really charming women, and I wanted to speak about what we had in common, so I talked about our family life and our values. We were really very much of one heart. And thinking to pay some compliment, I said, and meant it from the heart, how much we honor Jewish families who gather their families together on a Friday night to pray and bless the food and have the Sabbath meal. Well, they all smirked a little bit, and it went down quite nicely, but somehow I didn't quite get the warmth I was expecting back. And one of them said to me, you've got to laugh, she said. You know, when we get together, we say, you've got to hand it to those Christians. They do come together for their lovely Sunday lunch properly. We all think the others are doing it. And there are Islamic families, too, who are worried that their children are losing a sense of spiritual life and a family togetherness. Together, we can share some shared values and concerns and perhaps make some progress in interreligious dialogue. I've been accused a couple of times of being a Pollyanna Catholic. Probably most of you are too young, but did anybody see the film long, long ago starring Hayley Mills, where there's always something to be glad about? Well, in the days when going to the cinema was a treat, instead of just buying a thing of me and sticking it in the computer to watch, do you remember when you queued up and had an ice cream in the interval? Remember the interval? And you remember, and you only did it a few times, half-term? Well, in those days, I went to the Astoria in Purley and watched Hayley Mills in Pollyanna and loved it. But the message of Pollyanna is actually a marvelous one, that we should seek things to be grateful for. There are things to be glad about. We do it as a bit as a family, although it tends to be when everything's gone hopelessly wrong and, you know, you've run out of petrol and you're at the wrong kind of motorway service station and it's beastly and the loos are smelly, and your husband says, well, we can be glad that, we can be glad that we won't be here for very long because we'll get some petrol soon, or something like that. There is always something to be glad about. And I was accused of being a Pollyanna Catholic, trying always to seek the joyful and the good, instead of explaining that there's a terrible conspiracy and it's all the Freemasons and Our Lady said that we're all going to die the next Thursday. Have you seen all this sort of stuff, that goes around the internet? Sorry to be flippant, but do you know the sort of thing I mean? You don't get it? Yeah, well, yeah, all that. You get a lot as a journalist. I am unashamedly a Pollyanna Catholic. The message is a joyful one. Even when he was old and very frail, and could see that his joyful vision for Poland, his beloved country, was not turning out quite as well in freedom as everyone had hoped, but rather, as he had feared, that other factions, nationalism and greed and so on, were also present. Even though he'd been nearly killed and suffered from ill health pretty well all his life after that, even though he was very tired, John Paul went on being joyful. And his last messages were to young people, talking to them about being the hope of the church. Young people, Christ calls you, the church needs you, and the Pope believes in you and expects great things of you. Benedict XVI, when he came to England, walked into our hearts because of his joy. The smiling Pope, said the headlines, which only 2 days earlier had been saying unspeakably wicked, cruel, stupid things about him. Well, he's German, isn't he, And this joyful man walked into our hearts in Britain, walking down the steps of that aeroplane in Edinburgh in Scotland, I remember, looking as if he was really glad to come to the one country which had expressed its absolute loathing of him. Courage, joy. And the headlines were talking about the Pope who smiled. And I remember, we live near Wimbledon, where the nunciature is, where the apostolic nuncio lives, and where the dear Holy Father stayed the night. And I well remember the Wimbledon yummy mummies lining up with their babies. And they were being interviewed, why are you here with your baby? I want the Pope to bless my baby. Saw it on the telly. Thought it might be good for the baby. And they were absolutely right. It was very good for the baby. And I was there in Hyde Park when you could have heard a pin drop on the wet grass as thousands and thousands of people, mostly young, cascaded to their knees. And the dear Holy Father said that we will now lead and we will now pray to the Blessed Sacrament and led us in prayer. And I was there when my husband phoned up to say that the BBC had phoned. They wanted to have a debate with Peter Tatchell. He's the leader of Stonewall, which is the militant homosexualist group in Britain. And they wanted to have a debate on the papal visit. And Jamie said, what do you think? And I said, well, I'm not going to take part in it. It's a waste of time. The Pope's won. And Jamie said, well, that's what I thought, but I thought I'd phone you up anyway. So Peter Tatchell went home. Yay! Sorry. Pollyanna knew there were things to be glad about, even though she was an orphan having a difficult time. And if you remember the story, everybody is slowly won over. Do you remember the crotchety old great-aunt meets a former fiancé and they finally marry and are joyful together, and the crotchety clergyman discovers the God of joy and love and becomes joyful, and so on and so on and so on. I think Pollyanna is in the end, falls out of a tree and ends up in a wheelchair, but she's always got something to be glad about. You and I have so much to be glad about. Culture is what is going to drive history over the long haul. The church is the mother of culture. We are on pilgrimage splashing through the puddles. We have something joyful to communicate, and we have a Catholic television network through which we can communicate it. The future is going to be bright. Come and join in all the fun and happiness.
Thank you, Joanna. You have indeed brought back memories of the gay England, Merry England. And my question is, whatever happened to England, the England of Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, G.K. Chesterton? And not to mention those greats, Shakespeare and the likes, okay? And now, instead, what we hear now about England is England, well, like in America, you know, the same-sex union, the gaiety, so to speak, and sadly, the rise of Islam. And in fact, England, I believe, has the most number of Muslims, with respect, you know. And many of the English people are sort of subdued about, you know, their Christianity, their being Christians and Catholics, and still sort of, I don't know, became so wary or, fearful of the Islam. So what happened now is that Islam, or Muslim, overrun England. What happened?
This is a complex issue, obviously, and one can look at the social changes which have happened in England, the rest of Western Europe, and of course in America. But there's no doubt that demography is a large part of this, and there is a tragedy in the fact that we are killing our unborn children. And so the children that should have been there, the kids that should have turned up, are not there. And the birth rate is very low. We're extinguishing ourselves. And Islamic families tend to have a more natural approach to this, and they do just have children. They don't necessarily widely oppose abortion, but they don't practice it so much among themselves, except sometimes when it's a girl baby they don't want. So their birth rate is generally higher, and abortion and contraception have played a massive role in demoralizing Britain and also killing off the children who would have been simply there. As to Lewis and Tolkien, well, there's an enormous enthusiasm for both among younger Catholics, and their work is probably better appreciated now than it was even when I was a child. It's probably better appreciated now than it has been for any time since it was first written. The Lord of the Rings films made the whole kind of Tolkien thing huge. And C.S. Lewis is widely, widely read. And I went to a beautiful production of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe last summer in Kensington Palace Gardens. So, yeah, I wouldn't say that that has disappeared. And in a sense, much of what they were trying to achieve in the link between Christianity and culture is really quite strongly thriving, partly due to the excellent work of Stratt and Leonie Caldecott. Sadly, Stratt died just recently, and so he's much in my mind, the wonderful achievements. I wouldn't say it was over yet, but we've been badly demoralized. I mean, something like half of all children are now born out of wedlock. Marriage has been badly denigrated, and not least by the latest stupid activity of the government. I'm sorry, but it is incredibly stupid and wicked to claim that two people of the same age can marry. I'm not saying that for any reason. It's just a matter of reality, and there's no prejudice or anything there. We all live in a life where we mix with all sorts of folks, and we have all sorts of folks among our friends. That's fine. I'm a rotten old sinner like everybody else. It's just I don't particularly expect the government to acknowledge that something is so when it is not so. It's got nothing to do with anything else. So, just silly. It's silly. And cruel and unjust and wrong. So these are tangible things. There have been some government policies, but a lot of it's been brought on ourselves. And I do really think that a lot of it is Christians taking things for granted and not turning up.
Hello, my name is Grace Gates, and I'm from Asheville, North Carolina. I was just wondering, who's your favorite saint?
Oh, darling, that's really nice, and you speak up beautifully. Do you know, I just think it's a wonderful thing with the American children. They're all incredibly polite, and they call you ma'am, as if you're... And you're sweet. That's just being pompous. I'm sorry about that, darling. Who's my favorite saint? Well, you know, to be honest, I don't really have any problem, and it's the saint I met. John Paul, Saint John Paul the Great. Years and years ago, when everything was still awful in Poland, remember? We went to Poland, and, you know, like so many other people, we were smuggling stuff in. Do you remember when we had to do all that? It was enormous fun. And then afterwards, in the 90s, I went to a big meeting in Rome where there were really, really interesting, a whole lot of incredibly interesting people from Eastern Europe who told us what it was like, people who'd been in the Gulag, priests who'd been imprisoned from Russia and from Romania, I remember, people who told you what it was like. And we were talking about how we'd rebuild, and then, of course, we also had an audience with the Holy Father, and he spoke to us. And I've never forgotten that. You know, we lived through this huge adventure, didn't we, all of us? And we lived in the comfort of the West, watching it. But the Holy Father was Polish, and he was the one that made communism crumble. And through his actions, we lived that enormous adventure. And you and I were the lucky ones living it in the West. And there are people still alive who lived under the horrors of communism in the East. And that was an enormous experience that the whole church shared together. And now the man who led the church in those years is canonized. This has been one of the most thrilling eras in which to be a Catholic. And I met him. So he's my favorite saint.